Thank you. I'm going to start with just a quick apology. I won't make it too long. But last week, I didn't even realize until after the service was over how long I was up here talking for. Did any of you notice? Oh, good. Yeah, well, everybody says that. Anyway, it was a record. That was a personal best for me. We passed the hour mark. Didn't seem like anybody was falling asleep, which is good. I try to pay attention to that, but still trying to figure out how to do a nice, 45-minute sermon. And it's just difficult because there's a lot of things to talk about and a lot of things to say. So I'm going to try to be real concise and precise today, but I'm actually really excited because I think this is going to be so fun. It's funny how it works because you start thinking, we know we're in John. Everybody knows we're in John. Here we are in John. And so we kind of know, what's going to come next week. We finish the verses for today, and then next week, we pick up right where we left off in the gospel. So I have the whole week, to be thinking and preparing. And I knew what was coming this week. If you guys have your Bibles and you're in John right now, we're in John 6. And we had just finished last week talking about when Jesus feeds the multitude with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Angela and I were just into Art, and some others were up for a little family getaway up in Myrtle Beach. This week, we just got back late last night, but we were up there, and her sweet, sweet aunt was there, dear Aunt Beth, Art's sister, just a wonderful lady. And I'm up there, and I'm still, kind of working because you just can't really get away from work, especially with phones and the internet and stuff, and trying to figure out how we're going to get everything together for Saturday. We put out, put the word out there, and as Bo said, we've just been having people sign up. And we ordered some backpacks, and it wasn't quite enough. And I was sitting there thinking, I don't know where we're going to get the backpacks for all these kids that are signing up. And I'm like lamenting as we're sitting there at the table. Angela was there, I think Art was there, and Beth and her husband. And I'm just like, I don't know how are we going to get the backpacks for all these kids that are signing up? And then she says, she said, you just gotta have faith. It's just like the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. And I was like, oh yeah, right. The sermon that I preached 2 days ago. Right. Yes, it is just like that. And it was, very, very encouraging. And it's coming together. It's gonna happen. It's all gonna happen. We're, so excited at the response, but we just want to make sure, that we are prepared with, the material resources that we have, but even more than that, those of you who are going to be there and serving, we want to make sure that we're making connections with people, that we're not just kind of giving them a backpack and sending them on their way, but we want to make sure that we're, trying to meet needs, trying to connect with people, and trying to get people connected with the Lord. We're going to probably talk about some of that on Wednesday night. That's why there's some confusion about what's happening there. I'm not really sure. We'll see. Just come. It'll be fun. We'll see what happens. But as I was up there at the beach and thinking, I'm just going to use this as an opportunity to talk about my son. Because we were up there, and the first night that we got there kind of like in the Angela went up before me, and I stayed back and was here last week with you guys, and then I got up there, and we went down to the beach. We were in Myrtle Beach. If you don't know where that is, it's northern South Carolina, right at the border there, and the Atlantic Ocean. So not like when you go to Clearwater and the waves just kind of just like splash in, or if you ever for any reason would go to Green Key Beach and the water doesn't even move over there. It's quite stagnant and smelly. Over in the Atlantic, they have actual real waves. And when I first got there this first day, it was very, very windy. And we were going to just go for a walk on the beach in the evening hours there. And I took little Simon down to the water to show him the water. And I have a picture, and oh my gosh, look at that face. I wasn't posing. I think I was just getting the wind was blowing fiercely. Look at his little hair flipping. And he was like super pumped. He like really, really enjoyed it. And we were kind of sitting there in the water, as it can be there on the shores, a little bit unpredictable. And we're in, a couple centimeters of water at that point. And next thing you know, you can have, a little wave come in that's, 6 inches tall, maybe even a foot tall. The water can get right there before it comes back out. And some such thing happened as Angela was being the professional photographer there. And in this next picture, you can kind of see that he starts to look a little more like, this was really cool. And then he started to kind of like, he was looking at the intensity of the waves that were coming in. And it was probably just moments after that that he just started crying. That he just seemed very, very scared. And I was thinking, it can be frightening. I don't know if one of the waves came up and it got like the water kind of splashed like up over his knees, and he was like, and he starts crying. And he's kind of scared, but I picked him up after that, and then I kind of held him, and as I was holding him, at my shoulder, well, then he kind of just sat and stared, and he was just staring out at the water, just staring at the ocean. And I didn't even want to leave because he would not be bothered to look at or to see anything else, and he was just kind of staring at the sea, and he felt much more secure up there with me, obviously, and out of the water. But as I was thinking about our text for this week, not just an opportunity for me to show you adorable pictures of my chunky little son, but it got me thinking about how a lot of times in life that is us. We kind of feel like these little kids, little babies standing kind of at the shore of life, if you will, and looking out into the vastness of the sea, and not just wondering about the water itself, but maybe even the things that are in the water, some of the monsters therein. And that is why this morning we will be in John 6:16-21, and we are talking about sea monsters and the Savior. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, I don't believe in sea monsters. And I would say that most of us would say that we don't believe in sea monsters until we should go out to the beach and we start wading out into the water a little deeper. And then you get to that place where your toes can't touch the bottom anymore. For some of us, it's a little closer to the shore than others. And then all of a sudden you're kind of lifted up and your feet can't touch anymore. And I think kind of in those moments we all start believing in sea monsters very, very quickly. The idea that we are out of our natural habitat, that is solid ground and dry land. It requires much effort to tread water and to swim and to keep ourselves alive. We can't breathe out there in the water. We couldn't if we were stuck. Drink any of the water. There's nothing to eat. It is a wasteland for humans such as us out in the water. I actually was just because I was doing all kinds of reading and research, the longest that anybody has ever survived out at sea was 462 days. A guy in a little 12-foot fishing boat, and his motor broke down, and he had another guy there, 2 guys, they were out shark fishing, motor broke down, and they were adrift at sea helplessly. In that year and a half, he covered almost no ground, no territory. He didn't go very far. He was just kind of stuck, just floating around out there with no way to get back. His guy that was in the boat with him, it's really an interesting story, died about 2 months in, and he left him there on the boat for about a week, I guess, because he didn't want to be alone. And eventually he gave him a burial at sea, and then he started eating all kinds of sea turtles, and birds for some reason were landing, there on the boat, and he figured out how to catch them, and then he was trapping rainwater in a 5-gallon bucket that he had for a year and a half. So pretty remarkable to think, and we're all sitting there thinking, well, that seems impossible. And yes, it does seem impossible because the ocean is treacherous. And it is vast, and it is kind of the vastness of it. It is that unknowability of it that in a lot of ways evokes fear in us. I don't know if you have ever been out deep, deep into the ocean. If you have, you've presumably been on a boat. You have seen it maybe if you've been flying, but you get out there and it's in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing out there. And if you should ever have a thought, I've been thinking about it this week just for the hypothetical thought of being out in the water and just kind of get tossed overboard. You fall off a cruise ship or something in the middle of the night and no one knows, and then the cruise ship just sails away and you're just in the middle of an ocean waiting for something to eat you. Real sea monsters, a giant squid or a shark or any other, little thing. Seaweed at that point brushing across my leg would probably give me a heart attack and kill me. But the oceans are vast. Some ocean facts for you. If you did not know this, Earth's oceans cover 71% of the surface of the Earth. That's a good amount. They contain the oceans. 94% of all known wildlife is actually out there in the water somewhere. And despite all of the scientific advancements that we have made throughout the years, we have still only explored 5% of the entire ocean. 5%. So it's really, really big. Somewhere around 15 vessels are lost at sea every month. Did you know that? 15 vessels, and those are from small little fishing boats all the way up to big cargo ships, are lost at sea every month. Some of them, sometimes, they are able to get the Coast Guard to come in and the people are rescued and just the ship goes down, and then sometimes the whole ship goes down. The largest shipwreck that ever happened was a passenger vessel. This was in 1989 or something recently. Some of you might remember this. I was a child. But it like a cruise ship, something went down and 4,000 people drowned in the ocean after this cruise ship went down because they came into some bad weather and they just ship went down. There's nothing you can do out there. If you've ever watched it, anybody watch Deadliest Catch? Did you watch that show? I used to love that show. The ocean, it just gets crazy. It is chaotic out there. The waves, I believe the largest recorded wave ever was after an earthquake, and that was somewhere in Alaska. That was 1,700 feet tall. A wave, 1,700 feet tall. That's what we call a tsunami. Generally, the naturally occurring waves that are just out there, though, in the ocean on just any blustery day deep out to sea can get up to 100 feet tall. And that's enough to capsize any boat that you should send out there to sea. There's this really, really interesting poem that I love. There's a band, probably my favorite band. I think the name is Thrice. And the guy who writes the lyrics for them, his name is Dustin Kensrue. And he's just really, really brilliant. They put out this album called The Alchemy Index. No, that's not it. They put out this album called The Alchemy Index, and in it, he talks about the 4 different elements, and then he writes a sonnet for each one of the 4 elements: earth, fire, wind, and water. The one that he writes for water is this one. It's called Kings Upon the Main, and he writes it from the perspective as if the sea were talking to humanity. And he does one of those for fire, and he does one for earth, and he does one for the air. They're all incredibly compelling when you listen to them. But this is the one that he writes as if the sea were talking to humanity. And this is what the sea might say. The lesson you do well not to forget. Your life could be the one its wisdom saves. At sea, where you're beleaguered and beset, on every side by strife of wind and waves. Despite the best of maps and bravest men, for all their mighty names and massive forms, there will never be and has never been a ship or fleet secure against the storms. When kings upon the main have clung to pride and held themselves as masters of the sea, I've held them down behind the crushing tide till they have learned that no one masters me. And that is the reality of the ocean, of the great waters that basically surround this entire earth, is that they cannot be mastered. And we are mastered by them in many ways. It's not very difficult to understand why, for ancient people who had limited access to these waters, that they were a mysterious and scary place. Interestingly, in this day and age, we have more access to the cosmos than the ancient world did to the great deeps of the ocean. That we actually can come and go more effortlessly into outer space than ancient people could go out into the depths of the water. People did not leave the shoreline. You would not sail a ship outside of the view of the coast for many, many years. Most people think it was probably the Vikings around the 800s who really were the first ones to start to say, we're just gonna go that way and just see what's out there, and just started sailing. But in the time of Jesus, of course, the first century, nobody had sailed and traversed and gone out deep into the waters anywhere. They were terrified of them. And according to all kinds of different ancient myths and creation myths in particular, the waters were ruled by terrible, terrible monsters. This is a map of Iceland, and you can see it kind of looks like Iceland. This was created in 1590, so getting closer to the modern era. And if you can see there's all kinds of fantastic beasts that are in the water there, that are coming up from the water, because at this point they didn't know what was out there. They would be out to sea, and you would just see some big, massive thing just kind of maybe come out of the water and back down in, and you had no way of ever getting a look at it or knowing what it was, and it was a terrifying, terrifying place for people in the ancient world. Because of that, many myths, many creation myths even, centered around the ocean. That it was kind of from the ocean that the world was made. There are two different stories, mythos, that come out of Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, the area where almost everybody, secular or a believing Christian or a person of any kind of faith, believes that humanity started from, was in the Fertile Crescent. And it was right there that we have the earliest stories of the creation of the world. We find one in Babylonian, which is called Enuma Elish. And in Enuma Elish, you have basically this sea monster, Tiamat, who rises up out of the sea and challenges the god Marduk. So Tiamat, this sea monster, comes out of the sea, and there is this god reigning somewhere in the heavens, Marduk, and they have a little fight. And they fight each other, and Marduk subdues Tiamat, the sea monster. And then in Ugaritic, which is probably the most ancient civilization that we know of, there is one called the Baal cycle. You might be familiar with the name Baal. And in this one, Yam, which is actually the Hebrew word for sea, so this is the god of the sea, Yam rises up out of the sea also and challenges Baal to a fight, and Baal defeats Yam in this fight. And what's very interesting is we see something pretty similar to this in the Genesis account of creation. And there is a whole long apologetic discourse that I could go into here about when you find these similarities in these ancient stories. And then a lot of people will say, well, see, Judeo-Christianity is no different from this other story because it's really, they're just the same story, just being told in different ways. And I would say of that, isn't it interesting that everybody seems to be telling the same story? That everyone seems to be telling the same sort of story, and then we just have to try to figure out which one of these has the actual claim to truth here. But in Genesis 1, this is the Genesis account. You have in Genesis 1:1, you're all familiar. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and empty. And darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So in Genesis, what you have is this, what seems almost like this pre-existent, watery, chaotic mess that is the earth. It makes up the whole earth. It is this watery chaos, and it is described there in Genesis as being formless and void. It is the Hebrew tohu vabohu. It's very interesting that it rhymes. It is just tohu and bohu, and it means formless and void. And another way to understand those words, tohu can mean formless. It can also mean confused. It can mean chaotic. Or we can suggest that it means that there was no order, that it was without order. And then bohu is void. That's where we get the word void. It is empty, barren, and containing no life. So in the beginning, what the Bible tells us is the earth was chaotic and without life. And the Spirit of God comes down over the chaos and over the death, and then he begins to speak life and order into the earth. And this is God coming down from the heavens and ruling and reigning over the chaos of the sea. The point that God is making in the creation account is that he's speaking order and life into chaos and death, and it is similar to Enuma Elish and the Baal cycle, but it is also very different. However, the Jews did play off of some of the ancient mythos there, and perhaps there's something actually true about this. It's hard to say, but in Genesis, or rather in Psalm 74, we have this past account where God, it says in Psalm 74, verse 12, "But God is my king from long ago. He brings salvation on the earth. It was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monsters in the water. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the creatures of the earth." So there is this kind of mythological creature that comes up out of the sea, and the writer of the Psalms here is saying, you are the one who defeated the sea monster. Whatever treacherous, evil thing it was that came out of the deep and wanted to consume all of us, you defeated it. You crushed its heads, multiple heads, very interestingly. This is a past event. You can see all of the verbs there are in the past, and then we also have a future event of this in Isaiah 27. "In that day the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great, and powerful sword, Leviathan, the gliding serpent, Leviathan, the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea." So you have this past event that takes place where God slays this sea monster, and then you have this future event which is going to take place where God slays this sea monster. If you want a really good description of Leviathan and what this creature was, you can read Job 41. We don't have the time to get into that today, but in a certain sense, God has already destroyed the sea beast at creation. He spoke, if you want to say that death and chaos was personified in the sea beast, then God destroyed that at creation. But then the fall took place and threw the world back into chaos and disorder again. And this is why there is another future eschatological event which is going to take place where the promise of the sea beast being destroyed will be fulfilled once again. And you can see this very clearly in Revelation 13. And as John the disciple whom Jesus loved, who we're going to hear from here in just a moment, saw this vision. He said that the dragon, and this is, of course, the dragon is Satan, stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. So you have, again, this imagery that's being played on of these monsters that are coming up out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on its horns, and each head had a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but he had the feet like those of a bear and the mouth of that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. So this is, of course, if you have been here on any of the Wednesday nights when we've been talking about these sorts of things, this is a prophecy of the Antichrist, the dragon being Satan, and then the beast being this human person who is described poetically as rising up out of the sea. That there is this adversary that comes up out of the sea, out of the depths, out of the darkness, out of the chaos, and is coming to consume, in Revelation, the people of God. So we have that this idea that God has already defeated the sea monster, though the full reality of that has not yet been actualized. And this is something called the already not yet, and it is a tension that we live in the Christian life, the already and not yet. And it's most easily demonstrated in Jesus' victory at the cross, that death and sin was already defeated. Death and sin has already been defeated, but we are not yet living in the reality of that victory. We are, kind of, but its full reality will not take place until Jesus comes back down and takes us all to be with him. At that point, it is all fully and finally actualized. In the same way, this defeat of this enemy has not yet actually happened. And in this already not yet is where the Jews were living. They were living in this tension of God has been victorious over his enemies, but we are not yet living in the reality that God has actually conquered them. We see this immediately in their context as they were being ruled by Rome. And then, of course, we see this in the spiritual sense that there were spiritual forces at play all around them. That there was all kinds of spiritual warfare going on, demon possession, all of these sorts of things that we see in the Bible, all kinds of idol worship, perhaps even the manifestation of demons themselves. So God has already won the victory, but it hasn't actually been realized just yet. So they are living, the ancient people, and particularly the Jews, in this reality where sea beasts, sea monsters, these spiritual forces of darkness are a very, very real thing. And it is in this context that the story takes place. The story that we are going to hear today is of Jesus walking on the water. It takes place at the Sea of Galilee. And while the Sea of Galilee is not an actual sea as we might understand it today, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, it is the closest thing to one that most Jews would know. And even more than that, it symbolized all of the same things that the ocean would have. So a sea, when we're talking about it in Greek here, it is just referring to a large body of water. So that is why the Sea of Galilee, again, it's a big, big body of water. It is referred to as a sea, but it still typifies, symbolizes, and embodies all of that, all of the pictures, all of the fear, all of the monsters, all of that would be out in the great ocean. The Sea of Galilee, I have a satellite image of it here for you. It is some 600 feet below sea level. I don't have a picture. It's on the desktop. You might be able to drag it in there somewhere. It's a really good picture. We're going to need it. You can get it in there. I believe in you. It's some 600 feet below sea level, making it the lowest freshwater lake on Earth, the lowest freshwater lake on Earth, and the second lowest lake on Earth, second only to the Dead Sea. That's right. Good job, everybody. The Dead Sea, which is the lowest lake on Earth. There it is. There's the Sea of Galilee. So, 600 feet below sea level. It is some 13 miles long. So if you were going to measure from top to bottom there, it is 13 miles. And then it's at its widest point, it's 8 miles across. And at its deepest point, we have now discovered that it is about 200 feet deep at its deepest point. So that's pretty deep. Nobody in the ancient world was ever getting down to the bottom of that thing to see exactly what was down there, what might be living there, or where it went. And you can see that it's situated in the middle of a couple of mountain ranges right there. It basically is in a wind tunnel. You can see you have mountain range on either side of it, and then this kind of low plain area. You even have kind of a mountainous region up there in the north. So as every once in a while, wind would come through, and it essentially gets trapped in there, and it creates this sort of turbulent miniature little storm right there just over top of the lake. The weather can get very bad very, very quickly on the Sea of Galilee. And in this story, you might remember that in John 6, if you have your Bibles, in verse 1, it says that Jesus crossed over to the far side of the lake. So if you go to the lake again, the far side, they would have been over here. You're going to have Capernaum, which is where kind of the headquarters there is going to be up to the north, kind of west of the lake there. And the far side of that lake is going to be over there along this mountainous region over here. We talked about Tiberias, too, the other week. If you see that little area right in the middle on the left-hand side that kind of looks like a city, that's Tiberias, where it gets that name, the Sea of Tiberias. But the disciples are somewhere over here on this eastern coast, and they are now getting ready to go back over. If we read the Synoptic Gospels, that is Matthew and Mark, their account of this story, it says that after Jesus performed that miracle and fed the 5,000, he encouraged the disciples, get into the boat, go back over to Capernaum, head on over there, and he said, I'm going to stay here and talk with the people. And Jesus stayed, ministered with the people. Then it said he went up on a mountain somewhere over there. He went up onto one of these little mountains over here to pray, and the disciples went back across the water. So that brings us to our text today, John 6, and in verse 16, it says, when evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. And you will remember, as we've been talking about, that John plays very heavily on the imagery and on the symbolism of light and dark in his gospel. That if he's talking about the time of day, or if he's talking about whether it's light or whether it's dark, that these are tied to spiritual realities. And he is setting the tone for this account that is going to take place, that it is taking place in a dark spiritual reality. That these disciples are entering into a spiritual place of darkness. It's not just that it is also at nighttime, which it is. Very interestingly, even for us, things are just scarier at night, aren't they? Aren't bumps when you hear them in the night a little bit scarier than when you hear them in the middle of the day? And it is that same sort of thing that John is playing off of here. It's dark. And then he starts to talk about the water, the condition of the water, and he begins to describe the water in a very similar way that we see the waters described in Genesis. That it is chaotic and dark out in the water. And this is the place where the disciples find themselves. They find themselves in this chaos, in this darkness, and you can imagine that they are starting to become scared. Three of them, at least we know for sure, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, four would have been seasoned fishermen. But the others, you have a tax collector on there. He probably hasn't done a whole lot of fishing, hasn't been in a boat too much. You have, one of them that we know was just kind of a religious zealot. He probably wouldn't have been too brave at sea. And very interestingly, too, if we have not talked about this in here before, there's really, really good reason to believe that all of the disciples were, save Peter, were probably under the age of 20. Because that was the age when you had to pay the temple tax, and we have this very interesting account that happens with Jesus and the Pharisees. And the Pharisees ask Peter, why doesn't your rabbi pay the temple tax? And Peter says, I don't know. And then he goes and asks Jesus, and he said, why don't we pay the temple tax? And then Jesus said, because it's my Father's temple, and you don't pay taxes to your father. But he says in order to shut them up, he said, go down, and this is when he goes and catches a fish, and you'll find a drachma in its mouth to pay the temple tax for me and for you. And he only pays the temple tax, Jesus does, for Peter and for Jesus. But the Pharisees, when they're asking, are talking about all of the disciples. But Jesus sees need only to pay the tax for the two of them, which very interestingly might point to the fact that under Jewish law, you didn't have to pay the temple tax until you were 20 years old. So all of the other disciples may very well have been under the age of 20. So you might have had a bunch of teenage boys, basically, out in the middle of this crazy, crazy storm, in the middle of this spiritual darkness. And John even goes so far as to tell us how far out on the water they were. He said when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, of course, John didn't say miles, he used stadia, but we do the conversion there so that we have an idea of what that actually means, but 3 or 4 miles. So if you remember at the widest point up north there where they were, it's about 8 miles across. So they are quite literally right in the middle of the sea. They're right in the middle. When they had rowed that far, Jesus approached the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. It is quite interesting that in John's account, he doesn't mention the disciples being frightened until they see Jesus, and hang on to that. We're going to get there in just a moment. But they presumably, the disciples, were scared because they thought that they were seeing a manifestation of all of the ancient myths right before their very eyes. That as they're out there in the water, you can imagine they're starting to think, I wonder if any of those sea monsters are actually real. I wonder what's going to happen if we end up in the water. I wonder if I will drown. I wonder if something will eat me. I wonder what is going to happen to us right now. And then they look up and they see what Matthew and Mark describe in their Gospels, that they thought that they were seeing some kind of spirit, that some kind of spirit was coming towards them out in the middle of this watery chaos. And you can imagine that they would be terrified. You have the wind blowing, the waves crashing, the boat creaking, and they're probably considering how well they can swim and what might be waiting to eat them in the water. And then you have this weird ghostly figure which appears in the middle of the chaos, and they are going to find that ghostly figure is actually Jesus himself. It is quite interesting, the parallels here that are being drawn between what Jesus is doing and the creation account in Genesis. In Genesis, you have God creating and ordering and forming in the middle of chaos and in the middle of fear by the word of his mouth. That it is the word of his mouth that dispels all fear and all chaos. In Genesis, it tells us that the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters of chaos. That the earth is chaotic and dead and without any hope of anything. And the Spirit of God comes in and hovers over top of that water and brings order to it. Here, you have the very same thing taking place. You have darkness and chaos and the prospect of death. And then you see Jesus come walking on top of the death, on top of the chaos. And we just talked about the light and dark symbolism. Don't forget about the other primary form of symbolism that John uses in his gospel, which at this point we should all be well aware is water. That every time you see water, it also is pointing beyond itself to some kind of spiritual reality. That when John talks about water, water itself always represents something very human, some kind of human system, some kind of human concern. And then it's contrasted with a spiritual reality. So at Cana, you remember at Cana, you have the water. The water at Cana was being used for ceremonial cleansing. It is a human system. So God, it comes in, this human system, which they would make themselves ritually clean, but can never make you actually clean. Jesus takes that water, he takes that human system, and he turns it into wine, symbolizing his blood, symbolizing the thing that actually makes you truly spiritually clean. So the human, and then the spiritual. And then you have at Samaria, again, the woman at the well, and the water. And you have the water there symbolizing just what water is. It is what we need in order to survive. It is something that all humans need. You can only go something like 2 or 3 days without water, and then you will die. You need water, and Jesus said it's not this physical water that you really need. What you really need is the living water that I can give you. And he contrasts this water in this well, in Jacob's well, with the water that is inside of him that he can give to any one of us that will well up in us and become a source of living water. So you have that one. Then you have the pool of Bethesda, which we just talked about a couple weeks ago, and you remember the water there. And according to the human tradition and superstitions of the time, the water there, when it began to bubble, when the water was stirred, if you got into the water, you would be healed. And then Jesus contrasts that with himself, who shows up and says, you are not going to find your healing in this water. You're going to find your healing in me. And he takes that human system again and contrasts it with the spiritual reality which is found in himself. So now here, again, we should assume that we're going to see this same sort of pattern, that when John is talking about the water here, what he is talking about is the spiritual reality of chaos, of fear, of disorder, of death, of sickness, of sin, of any sort of thing that might bring horror to your heart and to your mind. All of that is being personified in this watery chaos that the disciples are finding themselves surrounded in. And what Jesus is doing as he's coming, walking across the water here, is not just performing an incredible miracle, which it is, but it is also a very real picture, a very real demonstration of his authority and of his conquesting and vanquishing sin and death and darkness. He is trampling the sea monster, if you will, under his feet. He's walking on top of the chaos. That as we would find ourselves in a situation like that, and we would find ourselves thrashing about and drowning and crying out for help and considering our mortality and waiting for death, because that's what's going to happen in some way, shape, or form. Whether we get eaten or we drown, whatever happens, we're going to die. Jesus comes effortlessly walking on top of all of that. This is told to us basically in other terms in Ephesians 1, and Paul is talking about the power of God, and he says that power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly realms, far above all rule and authority, power and dominion, and every name that is invoked, not only in the present age, but also in the one to come. And God placed all things under his feet and appointed him to be head over everything. That he says all powers, all rulers, all authorities, all sin, all death, all anything, anywhere that might be of any concern to you whatsoever, he's placed that under Jesus' feet. And this is what we see being acted out as Jesus is walking on the watery chaos. Again, in 1 Corinthians 15, then the end will come when he hands over the kingdom to God, that is Jesus handing it over to the Father, after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power, for he must reign until he's put all enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death, for he has put everything under his feet. And you see this again, that this is a picture that the greatest enemy that we had, is death, is Satan. Satan being personified in the Antichrist, being personified in the monster, the beast that will eventually rise up out of the sea. And what Jesus is doing is demonstrating his authority over every single one of those things by trampling on them, by walking right over top of them. And what's really cool is that he also gives us that same authority. In Luke 10:19, he says, I have given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and to overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing will harm you. In Psalm 91:13, you will tread on the lion and the cobra. You will trample the young lion and the serpent. And what Jesus is saying is, in the same way that I can just walk on top of the enemy, in the same way that I can just walk on top of sin and death, that it doesn't consume me, that I don't get swallowed up by it, I have given that authority to you as well. We actually see this in Matthew and Mark in Peter. Jesus shows up and he says, it's me, guys. And Peter says, if it's really you, tell me and I'll come out there on the water too. And of course, Jesus grants that to Peter, and Peter goes out and walks on the water right next to Jesus. Of course, after he takes his eyes off of Jesus and puts his eyes back on his problems, he begins to sink down into the water. Jesus chides him for having not much faith. Poor Peter. Oh my goodness. He's the only one that got out of the boat, and Jesus said he had no faith. But he will give us that same authority. So it's not just one that he has, but it's one that he shares with us. And then he says, Jesus, going back to our story, picking up in this verse, he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. And this is typical of any description of any theophany, that is a manifestation of God in the world around you, a personification of God in the earth, a theophany. The natural response of the people seeing it is that they are terrified, and that Jesus or God says, don't be afraid. Happens with angels too. It's funny, there's a bunch of memes that are out there, the little pictures with the captions on them, the memes, and they have them with these angels. There's a guy who did this artwork, and he tried to actually draw angels as they're described in the Bible, not like, a little Simon with wings and a harp like that, but like how the Bible actually describes angels, like with having like a head, with like 4 faces on it, and they're covered with eyes and have 6 wings and all of these different things. So this artist, I should have put a picture on here. He drew a picture of these crazy looking angels with all these wings and eyes and heads, and it's standing, in front of a person, and they're saying, don't be afraid. It's just me, a messenger of the Lord. I'm assuming when God sends them to talk to people, they look probably like humans, probably. And of course, there's all varieties of angels. But anyway, people see heavenly creatures, and they're very, very afraid. But what is even perhaps kind of more interesting here, this is the first time that Jesus uses an I am statement. In the Gospel of John, there are 7 I am statements, and he says, it gets translated in English, it is I, which is in Greek actually ego eimi, and ego is just the singular first person pronoun I, and then eimi is the verb I am. So that is how you would say I am. So what you have when you have the proper noun there added to the verb that already contains the noun, because in most other languages, nouns are actually contained within the verbs. So what you have here is an emphatic I. So if you have an I there and then another verb that is I am, then it would be an emphasis. It would be I am. And that's essentially what Jesus is saying. He shows up and he says, I am. In order to make it make more sense in the context of the story, when translators translate it, they translate it to, it is I. He's presenting himself. But what he is literally saying, and of course he didn't say this in Greek, he said it in Aramaic, which is very close to Hebrew, and you'll see there the Hebrew, which Bo talked about 2 weeks ago, the tetragrammaton, the Hebrew word for God, that is the Yod-He Vav-He, which is essentially I am. He would have said it, Jesus would have, in Aramaic, pretty close to Hebrew. But essentially what you have is Jesus shows up. And if there was any doubt in the disciples' mind who they were looking at that moment, it was all dispelled when he spoke the name of God. He came walking across the water and said to the disciples, I am. It's me, God. Don't be afraid. Here I am. And he presents himself to them as God. Of course, the terror that befalls them, John talks about this in Revelation 1. The same John who's writing this gospel account, he says, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. And then he placed his right hand on me and he said, don't be afraid. So this would probably be John when he finally writes Revelation, whenever that takes place. There's certainly up for discussion, but he probably remembers this is not the first time he's seen Jesus calling himself the I am God and telling him not to be afraid. In verse 21, after Jesus shows up, it says, then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. And it seems that what John is telling us in this story is that the goal of trying to reach the land was immediately achieved with Jesus' entry into the boat. But as John kind of has a different take on what is going on here than do Matthew and Mark, and that being probably most easily recognized in the fact that he doesn't say anything about Peter walking on the water, you would think that that's a pretty important detail that you would want to add there. Yes, Jesus on the walking on the water, super cool. Really crazy, a lot of symbolism going on there. We're understanding what's happening, but also Peter walked on the water. Why doesn't John say anything about Peter walking on the water? And then you have also this kind of variation at the end of this story in Matthew 14. When Matthew's telling the story, it says, and when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. They being Peter and Jesus, when they got into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. And then he says, and when they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. So it seems that there was still some more traversing to do in Matthew's gospel. And then in Mark 6, it says, and then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. This is a point that Mark is trying to make in his gospel, which is quite different from the one that Matthew and John are trying to make. Their hearts were hardened, and when they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. So you have this difference in the story, which is always very interesting when you run into these disparities between gospel accounts. You will have skeptics and critics of the Bible who will point to something like this and say, see, John said they were magically and immediately teleported over there, and Matthew and Mark said it still took them a little bit of time, so you can't trust anything that's in the Bible. It's pretty ridiculous claim, to be perfectly honest, anybody who would try to make a claim like that. This is something that actually happens quite often when you have retellings of stories. Just spending some time with Angela's family this week, and there were several stories that were retold by various family members about, when Angela was little and apparently just not more than a year old and could climb out of her crib and, as soon as they put her in there and she'd lay down, and next thing you know, she'd be out of the crib and running around in the room. Hope that doesn't run in the family there. We'll find out soon enough, I suppose. But it was interesting to hear her and her uncle go back and forth and try to remember, that story and tell it how they understood it. And I think that what's happening here is what you have is that John is telling this story as he remembered and as he understood it. And I think one of the things that's primarily different is it's really no wonder that John kind of leaves Peter out of it, because John's focus is on Jesus. It's not to say that what Peter did wasn't cool. It was really cool, but John wants everybody's eyes fixed on Jesus. He wants everybody focused on Jesus in this moment. And I think that that's exactly what happened, that when Jesus gets into the boat, John was standing there. It says in Mark, they were amazed. It says in Matthew that they were worshiping Jesus when he got onto the boat. And I think that probably in John's mind, what happened was his eyes were locked on Jesus, seeing Jesus as this embodiment of God walking on top of fear and sadness and sin and death, and showing up to them in a very real and in a very tangible way, and recognizing him for exactly who he was. And Jesus gets into the boat and he begins to worship him. And in John's mind, he's staring at Jesus one moment, and then the boat's bumping into the shore the next. And that time spent there in the boat and at sea after it became calm was lost in a state of amazement and worship. And this is something that we all experience in our lives. It's something that Albert Einstein talked about and really described in his theory of relativity. And he says a really easy way to understand the theory of relativity is, he says, you sit and talk with a beautiful woman for an hour, and it feels like 5 minutes. And if you hold your hand over a burning stove for 5 minutes, it feels like an hour. And we've all experienced that before. And I think that what John is telling us here is that when he was in the presence of the God who just conquered all of his fears, who just brought peace into the middle of this chaos, who just brought order into the middle of what seemed like was going to certainly be his death, that he said it just was, we were there in the middle of the water, and all of a sudden we were just at the shore. And this is a picture that is described really, really wonderfully in Psalm 107. And just want to read this as we close. Misael's going to come and play another song here. But in Psalm 107, in verse 23, it says that some went out to sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. You can see here the disciples in the boat. And then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. It's crazy. It's like this is almost like a prophecy of what was going to happen with the disciples as they were out there on the water. And it talks about this chaos being brought into order, and that the storm is reduced to a whisper, and that the waves are hushed. And then as I was thinking and kind of reflecting on this whole picture, I thought about Revelation 15. And in Revelation 15, verse 2, it says, and I saw what looked like a sea of glass glowing with fire. And I had always kind of puzzled at a sea of glass. What is that? What does a sea of glass have to do with anything? Why a sea of glass? And then as I was kind of studying and going over this sermon for today, I started to realize that, have you ever been out in the water, out when the water is just completely still and calm? We had a chance to go out fishing out deep into the water some time ago, myself and the boys, and the water was pretty rough out there that day. We were just kind of bouncing, across the waves on the boat. And I asked the captain, I said, is it always kind of like this out here, choppy, or is it always? And he said, oh, no. He said, sometimes it's just glass. It's just completely still. Even way out here 20 miles off the shore, there are times when the sea is completely still. And that's the picture that John is seeing when he sees the throne and when he sees heaven. Is that the sea, the watery chaos, all of the fear, all of the sin, all of the death, that all of that stuff that's personified in the dark, deep, troubled waters, he's saying it's all finally, once and for all, been put to rest. And that's the place where we will all be, where we will all dwell in the authority of God with all of those things having been trampled under his feet, with every monster being vanquished, with every sin being covered. That's the place that we will be for all of eternity. And I don't know, each one of you, where you are at in that journey, I presume, because there are so few of you in here that I've had conversations with, that most of us have come into fellowship with the Lord in some kind of meaningful way, that we have given our hearts to the Lord. But the waters around us still get troubled. It still feels like sometimes we're out in the middle of a big, vast, dark sea, and sometimes you honestly maybe just aren't sure if you're going to make it. I would say to you this morning, if that's you, I would encourage you to look to the one who walks on top of all of your fears effortlessly. Any struggle, any trial, any burden, anything that is going on in your life right now, it's already been put under the feet of Jesus, and he beckons us to come and to walk with him in the midst of that. I thought it was interesting as we were singing that song. I'm starting to get the impression that Misael left or something. Did he? Cool. Nice. We have a plan for a closing song, which is going to happen here in just a minute. I don't know what it is. Bo's going to take over in just a second. But we sang that song about the deep, crying out to the deep. And, as I was thinking about the ocean and all of this deep darkness and all of this crazy, crazy vastness and how we've, never seen and been there and all of that, certain parts of the ocean we know now are miles and miles and miles below the surface, and how deep that is. And when we're talking about the deep, crying out to the deep, and you're talking about the deep things of God and how deep that is, I think that sometimes I at least forget that the human experience is something that is really, really deep. That there are all kinds of real, deep, dark places in the ocean of our heart and our soul, if you will. I should be a poet, huh? Oh my gosh, look at this. That there's real hurt, and there's real pain, and there's real death and ugliness and monsters and all of those things that lurk beneath the surface for every single one of us. And none of it is beyond the reach of God. None of it is beyond the authority of God. None of it is beyond the control of God. And I would just encourage you in this time that I don't know what's about to happen, that you would take and you would bring that before the Lord, and you would ask him to be God in that place. I'm going to pray, and then we'll see what happens. Never know on a Sunday morning here. Heavenly Father, we thank you for who you are, God. We thank you for loving us, God, and we thank you that you have done all of this incredible work, God. That when a situation for us is hopeless, God, that when we are lost at sea, that when we are being tossed around by waves beyond our control, God, that you just come walking out effortlessly into the middle of it. And it is my prayer, God, that for myself and for each one here, Lord, that in those areas of our lives, God, where we are being buffeted, God, where we are being tossed and blown about, God, where our feet feel unsteady, God, when we don't know sometimes even if we will be able to have the next breath of air in our lungs, God. I pray that you would show up in the midst of all of that. I pray that you would just come and that you would bring light and life and peace and order, God, wherever it is needed here among your children. So we love you, God. We thank you for all that you do for us. And we ask it in your name.